True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Elana Steinberg's husband, Steve Steinberg, was a well-liked restaurant manager who had a gambling problem. Elana struggled to keep their finances afloat, but it wasn't easy. Then, on an otherwise normal night back in 1981, Elana was stabbed 26 times in their bed. Steve called 911, and he told the dispatcher that two bearded men had robbed them and killed his wife. Join us at the quiet end for Victim on Trial, Elana Steinberg. It wasn't long after Elana's murder when Steve confessed that he had actually killed her. Put on trial for murder, Steve's defense was temporary insanity. Yeah, he'd killed his wife, he said, but he'd done it while sleepwalking. And Elana had led him to it with her nagging and her excessive shopping. Prepare to be outraged. This is a case where the killer was treated as a long-suffering victim and the real victim was put on trial. We are going to need some alcohol, and let's have some beer.
Okay. Thought this was a fitting beer for this case. It's called Devil's Ale.
Yeah, it fits.
It's brewed by Santan Brewing Company in Chandler, Arizona. It's an American pale ale, 5.5% alcohol by volume. I had this on tap one day at the Phoenix airport where we were waiting to head back here, home. Beer's a dark amber color, small head, some nice lacing. Got a citrus aroma, a little bit of caramel. Grapefruit taste, caramel taste. Pretty nice beer. Easy to drink.
Sounds delish. Let's open it up. Nice aroma. You're right. Very caramelly. Thank you. Pass one over.
Ha, here you are, dear.
Okay. Well, let's head down to the quiet end. And I just want to say this case was recommended to us by Jessica. So thank you, Jessica. Much appreciated. It's a great case, but I have suffered a lot over it. Very angry and frustrated over it. So let's see how our listeners take it.
So the story of Elana and Steve Steinberg begins in the suburbs of Chicago. Their families, both his and hers, were Chicago people for generations. Elana's maternal grandfather, Samuel Lubin, came to America from Ukraine when he was still a teenager. As with many Jewish families who had roots in Europe, part of their history is lost. Sam Lubin met Elana's grandmother on the boat coming to America. Lubin became a manufacturing jeweler in Chicago, making pieces for different jewelers. He opened a shop on Michigan Avenue, which was a bit of an unusual location back then. Most of the Jewish business people stayed in the areas where they had first settled. But Sam Lubin was aggressive and a successful man.
Yeah, the Lubins had 4 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. And the family lived a traditional and quiet life in Garfield Park. That's one of the first settlements for prosperous Eastern European Jewish immigrants when they moved from the west side of Chicago. Sam Lubin's daughter, Edith, Elana's mother, went to work as soon as she had graduated from high school. College for a girl was not a priority for her family in the last years of the Depression. The Lubins were merchants and jewelers and didn't think too much about higher education back then. That would happen more with the next generation. So Edith's first job was as a switchboard operator in the office of the largest commercial laundry in Chicago. Edith's mentor in her job was the boss's nephew, a young Canadian man named Barney Singer. Barney's parents had settled in Canada, and they were very religious and old-fashioned. They lived in traditional Orthodox ways, and becoming American for first-generation women like Barney Singer's mother wasn't easy at all. The Singers sent Barney to Chicago to get a start in life and to work with his uncle. Barney loved his uncle. Barney always seemed to be in a good mood. He was just that kind of a guy. He was known as a sweetheart, and until his daughter's death, nothing ever seemed to make Barney angry.
Now, when World War II broke out in 1941, Edith and Barney were having an office romance, so he attracted her eye, or vice versa. Barney had the approval of Edith's family. After Pearl Harbor, Barney joined the Army and was sent to Fort Sheridan for basic training. Early on, he was moved to Tacoma, where everyone said Barney's outfit would be one of the first to be shipped overseas to the Pacific. Barney and Edith were engaged by then. Edith went west on a train by herself to get married, which was a pretty daring trip for a 19-year-old young lady who had never been away from Chicago before.
Yeah, back then girls just didn't take trips to see their boyfriends, especially girls from traditional families like Edith's. But then during wartime, many young women were doing it. Sam Lubin told her before she left, "If you go out there, you go to get married." And Edith really had no intention of doing anything else. So they were married by a rabbi at the base in Tacoma. There wouldn't be a big wedding like they would have had if they were back in Chicago. And then just 10 weeks later, Barney was shipped out to the South Pacific. Edith got back on the train then and returned home, and Barney didn't return for 4 more years. His outfit were all combat engineers attached to the Army Air Force and the Navy's Seabees, and most of these EABs were overseas by the first year of the war, and they would stay to the bitter end. In the South Pacific, their job was to build airstrips as soon as the ground was captured from the Japanese. So this was hard work. They lived in tents and mud for weeks on end, and they worked 24-hour shifts to keep the bridges and the roads open.
Back in Chicago, Edith waited for the war to end. She had gone to work for her father in the jewelry business, learning to polish bracelets and rings. Barney came home in 1946. His Uncle Morris had died, and 2 of his sons were grown and managing the laundry by then. To Barney, it was time to move on. So he went to work for a garden and outdoor furniture store. Sales of umbrellas, swimming pools, and barbecues were booming, and this became Barney Singer's business. Edith got pregnant, and all of her friends were having babies too, so moving to the suburbs became a popular thing. One of Edith's sisters moved south, but the rest of the family moved north.
Yeah, the Singers rented a duplex in Albany Park before Elana was born on November 14th, 1946. Elana was tiny, she was a pretty baby, and she was quickly adored by her parents. Edith loved to dress up Elana and walk her around the neighborhood in a big old-fashioned stroller. So Edith and Elana became inseparable. And when they were together, they seemed to just kind of shut out everyone else. Elana was never a troublesome child. She was quick, intelligent, but there was never any plan for her to go to college. It was Elana's younger brother Mitchell, not Elana, who went away to college, and this was the tradition for Jewish middle-class families at this time. When Elana was about to enter high school, the Singers had moved again, but they were still in the northwest suburbs. Then in 1960, Elana enrolled in Maine Township East. Maine East was a distinguished high school built in the 30s, one of several excellent Chicago high schools. Elana's class was one of the last before the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. The class of 1964 was before Vietnam, protests, and the drug craze. In the yearbook, all of the girls had beehive hairdos or flips, both hairstyles which meant sleeping with rollers on every night.
The girls wore knee-length dresses, crop jackets, and pumps like Jackie Kennedy. Boys all had short hair and thin dark ties. And this was the era of musical girl groups, like the Shirelles and the Supremes. And Dick Clark's Bandstand was all the rage. Get home from school and watch it.
Right.
It was an innocent time, but that would soon change. Elana was always a social person. She loved to go out, she loved to talk for hours with her friends, and she was very interested in boys. Her closest friend was B.J. Kaufman, a cheerful, pretty blonde whose personality went along with Elana's. According to B.J., Elana was lively, funny, and could be outrageously outspoken sometimes. She was never boring, and she was very intelligent.
She was, and she was introduced to Steve Steinberg when she was just a junior in high school. According to her friends, Elana was taken with him from the very beginning. She thought that Steve was cool and very worldly. It wasn't only his good looks that attracted her. He had this kind of tough guy personality that was appealing and different. He wore a leather jacket, and he did daring things that the other boys didn't do. He wasn't like the other boys Elana had met in school. So Steve was almost 19, and he was already out of high school. And when Elana brought him home, Edith and Barney Singer were friendly to him. Steve had a family of his own, but to Edith he seemed like a needy boy. She liked to mother people, and Steve fit right into that. He flattered her, he followed Barney around, and was soon more than just a boyfriend of Elana's. Steve wasn't the first choice for a husband for Elana, in Edith's mind at least. She would have preferred a professional man like a future accountant, attorney, or dentist, but that just didn't seem like a practical expectation for the singers back then. So Elana's parents welcomed the handsome and quite pleasant young Steve with a lot of affection and inclusion. Edith would later say that she kind of felt sorry for him back then.
Steve Steinberg was born in 1944 on the south side of Chicago. Steve's father was a butcher, and he owned his own small butcher shop. Steve's mother, Esther, was very serious, strict, and quite religious. They had a daughter, Gloria, who was 3 years older than Steve. The Steinbergs lived a pretty modest lifestyle. Steve was brought up with a traditional religious education. In grade school, he made friends easily, and this was a gift that would follow him throughout his life, and was incredibly valuable to him, particularly when he needed it. When he was 12, he had a very traumatic experience. Steve's father had stayed home from work for several days with what seemed to be a flu-like illness. No one was really worried because he had been well enough to wrestle and play with Steve on the bed, as they had often done. But while horsing around, Steve's father suddenly gasped and fell back onto the bed. He died right in front of Steve.
So I have to admit that would be traumatic.
Sure would. And you might even think, as he did, that you were causing it.
You might. I mean, at least subconsciously, I guess. But it turns out that those flu-like symptoms were probably the precursor to a fatal heart attack. And the guilt on the 12-year-old Steve after this wrestling match did have to be a lot for him to live with. In fact, 25 years later, Steinberg would still be very emotional about this incident. And of course, life changed for the Steinbergs after his father's death. Steve, Gloria, and their mother no longer had their own apartment. They had to move in with Steve's grandparents on the north side of Chicago, and his mother, Esther, had to go to work full-time. Gloria and Steve were enrolled in schools on the other side of town. The years in his grandparents' home after Steve's father died were pretty ideal, though. Everyone was warm and close in the family. His mother was strict but very loving, and the grandparents were incredibly supportive to all of them. But those were also the years when Steve became a compulsive gambler. So psychiatrists now believe that there may be a chemical component to compulsive gambling. Steve's brain chemistry gave him almost a cocaine-like high when he was gambling. Someone who becomes a compulsive gambler has certain personality traits. Many compulsive gamblers have experienced something unusual. They may have had an encounter with death in their early adolescence. First, the gambling is minor and the gambler is successful and feels in control. But then somewhere along the line, his or her luck runs out. Once the gambler begins to lose, the progress of the disease becomes rapid and can be devastating. In the end, the compulsive gambler may be financially destitute or even in jail, and family relationships are destroyed. So this progression fits the life of Steve Steinberg. His early teen years were the years when Steve first began to gamble seriously, in card games and on sports cards. By the time he was in high school, he was gambling every day. He was able to win, and getting the money gave him a thrill. When Steve was in high school, he made his first big win, and that was likely what set him out on his path of compulsive gambling that would last well into his adulthood.
Yeah, the importance of that first big win is crucial. If someone with the potential for compulsive gambling loses and keeps on losing, he will eventually move on to some other activity. But with that first big win, the picture changes. Gambling becomes a part of his life, and the gambler is hooked. The compulsive gambler has a fantastical belief that he is blessed with skills that no one else has, and that things will always turn out right for him. That's a fantasy that sustains the gambler when things get bad in the inevitable losing stage. When he begins to lose, he is still confident that his magic had just left him temporarily. It will be back in the future. For Steve, this was kind of a magic in the end for him. He fully believed he would beat the system.
Yeah, in 1964, Steve's sister Gloria was getting married. Steve was 19, and he'd just met the 16-year-old Elana Singer. As soon as Steve met Barney and Edith Singer, an emotional hole in him seemed to be filled. From the beginning, He was ready to adopt the Singers almost as his new parents. Barney was the father figure that was missing from Steve's life, and he and Barney became inseparable. He was able to charm Edith completely, too, and Edith thought that her daughter's boyfriend was not only good-looking, but sweet and attentive. She cooked for Steve, who was thin and hungry-looking back in those days. Barney and Edith treated Steve just like a son, and Steve was like a big brother to Alana's 13-year-old brother, Mitchell. Elana took a job as a legal secretary in downtown Chicago as her relationship with Steve was getting serious. Marriage was expected soon. In the 60s, double and triple dates were traditional, and Elana liked to fix up her friends with friends of Steve's. One of Alana's best friends eventually married Steve's best friend, and they even bought a house on the same street in Arlington Heights when Steve and Elana did. But in general, Steve's friends didn't care much for Elana. She was too outspoken and quick-witted for them. She didn't care what they thought about her, and they really resented that. So when Elana and Steve had a breakup, his friends were secretly happy about it. And for a short time, Elana dated a lawyer that she'd met at work. But nothing came of that relationship, and Elana went back to Steve. Steve's friends thought he was being pushed into marriage by Elana. By 1966, they'd been going out for nearly 3 years, and Steve was pretty much living at the Singer's house, so they agreed it was time to get married. Steve had finished his National Guard service, and he'd been promised a promotion at the pharmaceutical company where he was working as a buyer. So with their combined incomes, they could support themselves. But the wedding created a rift between the in-laws. It involved money. Edith Singer thought Steve's family had reneged on some of their obligations. They had left early from the dinner for out-of-town guests the night before the wedding, and the Singers had paid the bill when they weren't expecting to, and Steve was very embarrassed about this problem.
Elana was the first of her friends to get married. She was 19 and Steve was 22. Everyone thought that Steve was doing well because there always seemed to be plenty of money for whatever they wanted to do. The Steinbergs dined out frequently, and Elana was buying furniture to decorate their home. Elana did know that Steve went to the track and gambled a lot, but she wasn't that worried at first anyway. Barney Singer had gambled. She had grown up around gambling, and there never seemed to be any serious trouble. Steve and Elana agreed that she would manage the finances and pay the bills. She was frugal, but money just seemed to slip through Steve's fingers. So when he was doing well, he was a big spender. He liked to leave big tips at restaurants and buy presents for Elana, and always liked to carry a lot of cash around with him. Sometimes Steve would win more than usual at the track, and then he'd come home and give Elana several $100 bills.
Yeah, they took a vacation to Las Vegas, which was always Steve's favorite place.
Well, yeah, you can gamble there.
Yeah, and in Vegas, Steve lost big for the first time, and this was something he did not handle well, and he had to conceal it from Elana. So the losing phase had begun for Steve. And from then on, Steve was betting to recoup past losses, not betting to win new money. And he was beginning to evade Elana's questions on the extent of his gambling. His friends knew it, and most of them supported him and just thought of Elana as a nag. Some would help to hide some of the losses from Elana. Overall, they thought Steve was a winner, because he pretty much portrayed himself that way. Elana and Steve would have 2 daughters together, and Elana was alone in worrying about their financial future. So it had to be a lonely life for Elana, worrying about Steve's gambling and not being able to confide in anyone about it. Elana did confide in her friend once, after she found out that Steve had extended a bank loan without telling her. They'd gone to Vegas, and Steve had again lost a lot of money. Then a few months later, Elana found out that her car wasn't paid off when she knew it should have been. So she called the bank, and the loan officer told her that the loan had been extended by Steve, and he had actually signed her name without asking or telling her about it. And after that, strange things started happening. A rash of burglaries, kidnappings, and robberies began to follow Steve Steinberg wherever he went. When their daughter Tracy was a baby and the family was living in an apartment in Des Plaines, 2 burglars broke in when Steve was alone. He told the police the 2 men had bushy hair and bushy beards, and that they had tied him up and put him in a closet. Steve said that when he escaped, he found out that the bushy-haired men had taken all of Elana's jewelry, and this was fine jewelry that the Lubin family had given Elana for wedding presents and gifts over the years. After that robbery, there was no problem with the insurance claim, and no one doubted Steve's story about these two bushy-haired robbers. The agent was related to one of Steve's friends, the insurance agent, and this story remained in people's memories, and they would talk about it years later. It was very dramatic and not just a normal burglary. There was a real flair to the story, and Steve had been in danger. So later there was another mysterious burglary. Edith Singer had kept a little stash of money in a cookie jar in a kitchen cabinet in her apartment. Then one day it vanished. Steve accused the janitor at the apartment building, and Edith believed Steve and let everyone in the apartment building know what she suspected. The janitor's wife actually called up Edith to complain. She was angry and she was defending her husband, who hadn't taken the money. But by this time, Steve had a job working for Barney Singer and his partners, who had opened several pool and patio stores. Steve was actually managing one of them. But then one night there was another mysterious theft. $4,000 disappeared from the cash register at Steve's store, and Steve had been the last one there. But Steve blamed the bookkeeper. The partners were upset and they suspected Steve, and they blamed Barney Singer for standing up for his son-in-law. But Barney was outraged. He defended Steve. So they exchanged harsh words and the business relationship was never the same. Eventually, this partnership broke up and Barney left the business.
So you might think that if it was fairly common knowledge, at least in the family, that Steve had a gambling problem, and his money disappears on more than one occasion, maybe there's a link.
You might think so, and I bet Elana knew, but I think Steve put up a pretty good front.
Well, yeah, I think it's evidence of Steve's charm that Barney and Edith refused to think that he could be responsible for the thefts that had happened over the years. The idea that their son-in-law could be a thief and stealing from their own family resources was inconceivable. He was Elana's husband and the father of Elana's children. They loved him, and they were blind to his faults.
I could see that. It does happen.
Sure. You have to be a good salesman, though.
He was.
If Elana was worried about his gambling, she kept most of it to herself.
Yeah, experts say this is a common reaction for a wife who realizes for the first time that she's married to a compulsive gambler. It's denial. At first, the wife fools herself into acceptance of her husband's gambling as a normal thing. Then she scales down her expectations of the marriage so that she can just kind of live with it. She closes her eyes to his raiding their bank accounts and the children's piggy banks, the missing jewelry and savings bonds, and his excuses, and even his outright lies. What Elana did is she threw herself into parenting, homemaking, and a very full social life. She liked to organize groups of couples who would meet for dinner or go to parties. She worked for 3 years after they were married, but then she stopped when her daughter Tracy was born in 1969. The Steinbergs were still in Des Plaines then, but they wanted to buy a house, and the one they found was in Arlington Heights. The Steinbergs were able to buy a modest brick split level for a bargain price, and then they had some money left over for Elana to decorate it. Once in suburbia, Elana was a typical wife and mother. Steve was attentive to his family, but he began to stray. Unlike his gambling, the new problem was something that Elana would not tolerate. Steve was seeing another woman. He was traveling back then, and she thought the woman was someone he was meeting on the road. And Elana reacted decisively. She called her parents, Barney and Edith, over to the house, and Steve had to apologize to all 3 of them. Then she told him if he didn't give up the other woman, she would be getting a divorce. So Steve was basically put on probation by them, which I give her credit.
Well, he needed to be.
He did, but some of Steve's friends just saw her as very overbearing.
Well, sure. They've already formed that opinion.
They have, and she's just trying to control her life. So after their second daughter, Shawn, was born in 1975, the family seemed to be at a real financial dead end, although no one ever really talked about it. Everybody did acknowledge that Steve could sell anything, but he never developed a solid sales career. Steve was always a hard worker, but there was something shady about his salesmanship. He took too many shortcuts. The cloud from the incident at the pool and patio store was lingering on as well. Steve usually relied on his father-in-law to find him another job, and Barney had always obliged. But now the Steinbergs entered into a new life in Arizona. Elana's brother Mitchell Singer had been sent to Arizona State University. While there, he had met and married the daughter of a well-known Phoenix businessman who had a chain of restaurants. So after visiting Mitchell several times, Barney and Edith decided to move out west too. Many Chicago people were doing this. Arizona was not as popular as Miami Beach, but it was up and coming. With Barney and Edith Singer gone, the Steinbergs were a bit lost though. So Barney suggested that his son-in-law come to Arizona and that the two of them open a store together in Phoenix. So for the first time, Steve would have his own business, which also meant he could control his own time and manage his own money. So if he needed money, he'd be able to take it because it would actually be his. Of course, starting a new business would take work, but Steve had always thrived on work. It is routine for a compulsive gambler to put in 14-hour days or work 2 jobs at a time. The facade does have to be kept up, and the bets have to be made. They can never stop or even slow down because their house of cards will then collapse.
Elana and Steve decided to follow Barney and Edith to Phoenix, but Steve needed money. There had been a downward spiral in his finances in Chicago. So when it was time to leave, he borrowed $5,000 from his stepbrother. Steve promised that he would pay him back, but 6 years later, Steve still would owe him the money. He always paid his bookies and usually repaid his friends, but for some reason, money borrowed from family members was of less importance. Oh, after all, they're family.
Well, yes. But if they want it back, you probably should give it back.
You should. Their house in Arlington Heights sold pretty quickly, mostly because of Elana's skillful decorating. It was just a tract house, but it was beautiful inside because of all the things Elana had done.
Yeah, Elana flew out to Scottsdale with their baby girl Sean and 6-year-old Tracy, and they stayed with Edith and Barney until the house that Steve and Elana were buying was ready. Steve told Elana that he would stay behind in Chicago and then drive one car out there and hire someone to drive Elana's car out to Arizona. But then another of the strange crimes that always followed Steve happened. Elana and the girls were in Phoenix waiting for Steve to arrive when there was a call. A man with a gruff voice said, "I'm somewhere between Vegas and New Mexico and your car just blew up, lady. I'm leaving it here." So Edith immediately called Steve in Chicago, and of course she was very upset. And he told her not to worry. When he got to Arizona, Steve said, he would go back to New Mexico and pick up Elana's car. But when he finally did go back to New Mexico, he didn't return with her car. Steve told Elana that it was demolished. So for his friends in Chicago, Steve had a different story, though. People had tried to murder him, he told them. He didn't know why, he said, but they pushed him up on the hood of the car and drove fast, and he had to escape. They were going to kill him, he said. And then they took the car and wrecked it. In hindsight, this was a fantastical story, but these kinds of things just seemed to happen to Steve. Steve told Elana that it didn't matter anyway, because they now had a fresh start in their new house on Via de Luz.
So there was a big difference between the lifestyle Steve and Elana left behind in Chicago and their new lives in North Scottsdale.
Yes, they were really moving up.
The down-to-earth mixed neighborhood of Arlington Heights, where people went bowling and took their children to the park, was behind them. In the Steinbergs' new Arizona home, the lifestyle was affluent and stylish. Everyone they met had a swimming pool in the backyard and drove luxury cars. It seemed like the homeowners had wealth in Arizona, but in reality, their lifestyle was built on a delicate foundation. Yes, the houses were impressive, but they had huge balloon payments coming, and many of the luxury cars were leased. So everyone seemed to be in the same boat, but nobody seemed worried about that. Mitchell Singer, recently out of college, led the ambitions and changed the status of the Singer-Steinberg family. Mitch had become a success virtually overnight in the Phoenix restaurant world. He had married the daughter of Herb Applegate, who owned a chain of successful restaurants in Arizona and California. So that gave him a head start. But Mitchell just had a gift, a real knack for the restaurant business. With his father-in-law's encouragement and support, Mitch had worked every job in a restaurant: busboy, bartender, cook, manager. Mitch had talent in the tough business of running a restaurant in Arizona, a place where restaurants went out of business every day. Well, not just Arizona.
Yes, everywhere. But in that day in Phoenix, it was really very competitive.
Yeah, well, it's a boomtown, right?
Yes, it was booming.
When Herb Applegate died, Mitch started his own restaurant. He chose a location in downtown Scottsdale. From the night the place opened, it was obvious that Mitch had started something big. The location was perfect and the food was good. The restaurant was the first of Scottsdale's Fern Bars, restaurants where young professionals could meet, drink good wine, and sit beneath soaring ceilings with well-placed lighting. Mitchell called his place BB Singer's, and it was an immediate success. There were lines every night waiting for tables, and BB Singer's was frequently mentioned in newspaper columns.
Yeah, but unfortunately, no one in the Singer and Steinberg families really understood that Mitchell's prosperity in the restaurant business had been built on an unstable base. Mitchell had actually put little to no capital into the project. The whole business was a package arranged by the landlord. So Mitch paid the rent and the equipment lease out of the proceeds, and he really owned nothing. So if and when the cash flow at BB Singer's ran dry, there would be real trouble. There was nothing to fall back on. But Mitch tried hard and worked long hours. Like Steve and Elana, he was a workaholic. And he did know important people all over town. He moved into a gorgeous Scottsdale house and leased a foreign sports car with a cell phone, which was very rare back then. He began to get investors, too. It was all very impressive for a man who hadn't yet reached his 30th birthday. Now, at first, the pool and patio store started by Barney and Steve did well. The location was in a suburban strip mall in a neighborhood that was booming with new construction. Almost every house in Phoenix has a swimming pool, and the supplies for the pools like chlorine, pool toys, and patio furniture were all found at the store. Barney knew this business well, and Steve worked hard. They kept the store open 7 days a week until 9 o'clock at night. It took self-discipline for Steve not to take from the cash flow of the business. Money in the register had to be a constant temptation for him. Steve was not a favorite with the suppliers either because he would push them around, and he knew how to avoid paying his bills. And he could give anyone the impression that he had 4 or 5 lawyers working on his behalf. So just 1 year after they opened that store in 1976, Steve was robbed again. Now this time he told the police that a young man on a motorcycle had driven up to the shopping center on a quiet 4th of July weekend and forced Steve into the office in the back of the store. The robber fired a shot through the water cooler and into the wall and told Steve he would kill him if he didn't give him all the money. So Steve told the police he had handed over a plastic bag with 3 days' deposits in it, $7,360 in cash, and then the robber had left. Of course, there were no witnesses. The hole in the drywall in the office held a .38 caliber slug, and it was only the first of many robbery and burglary reports that Steve would make while in Arizona. Steve was routinely tied up, shot at, run down in the desert, or robbed at gunpoint.
He's one of the most unlucky people I've ever heard of.
Just so unlucky, yeah.
Now, if Elana doubted any of Steve's stories, she didn't seem to tell anyone. And Barney and Edith, for their part, didn't think the incidents were unusual. That is, until after Elana's murder. But this seems to be very naive. It sure does. Steve got a new bookie in Arizona. His name is Ira Gaines. Now, Gaines was a former over-the-counter broker from New York who became a salesman in Phoenix. Steve always said that Gaines was not a bookie in the traditional way, but just a friend who placed bets through another friend in New York. Yeah. He's not a bookie. Ira and Steve talked at least twice a day, every day.
That's a lot.
It is, for just a friend. Steve began depositing money directly into Gaines's checking account at the bank. Ira and his wife, Sherry, were friends of the Steinbergs, and if Elana objected to Ira's relationship with Steve, she showed no outward signs of it.
Well, I think it was really important for Elana to look okay and have everything look good, including her husband.
Right.
Now, over time, the amounts of Steve's bets increased. He was working now in multiples of hundreds and thousands of dollars. He would bet thousands on sporting events like Monday Night Football, Sunday pro games, the baseball playoffs, and the World Series. Elana, like Steve, had endless energy, and she never seemed to stop moving. Her talent and energy were concentrated on interior decorating, and everyone commented about what Elana had done with her house. She did spend money, there's no doubt, but a lot of what she accomplished was from her own labor. In the winter of 1978, Barney and Steve's management of the pool store was failing. The Christmas season had been disappointing, and creditors were beginning to call. There were no reserves or emergency funds for this dry period either. One of Steve's new friends, David Goldfarb, asked Steve if he could list the business for sale in his business brokerage. So Barney and Steve were actually relieved because they were not prepared to wait it out until business improved. The store did sell quickly because, despite the financial drain of the salaries, it was a healthy business. Steve and Barney made a profit, and Steve had been promised a job working for Mitchell in the restaurant business. So working for Mitchell did give Steve a salary, also a Lincoln Mark II and some fringe benefits. He also gained the prestige of being the manager of one of the B.B. Singer's restaurants. To Steve and to their friends, the Steinbergs were moving up in the world, and he loved it. And most of the customers just loved him, too.
Yeah, but 1979 was the start of Steve's restaurant career. But unfortunately, it was also the start of a new phase in his gambling. That year, he began to resort to bank loans for bailouts, concealing them from Elana. Steve had done at least one secret bank transaction before on Elana's car. That's when he forged her name on.
Yes.
But for a time in Arizona, he had been able to keep ahead of things. But in 1979, he started to borrow to gamble with a complicated mix of bank loans, juggling and overlapping them, taking out new loans to make payments on the old loans. In the 2 years following the sale of the pool store, Steve took out loans from 4 different Phoenix banks. Steve Steinberg was approved because, at least on paper, he and Elana were very solvent, because Steve always turned his paycheck over to Elana to pay their bills.
Right, so she really had no clue how bad it was. Then in December of 1980, the third Singer restaurant, the Brass Derby, opened up and Steve became the Derby's manager. While Steve was working so hard, the crime wave that followed him was still very active. From the time he began to work for Mitchell until he left, there were 6 thefts of cash from the register. Now, usually the amount taken was between $3,000 and $5,000. Steve would make a police report, but none of the burglaries were ever solved. At Steve's suggestion, the employees of the restaurant were asked to take polygraphs. And at work, the relationship between Steve and his brother-in-law became volatile. But Mitch always had the upper hand. They would scream at each other a lot, but Mitch had a terrible temper, and once he tore a phone off the wall. Steve was explosive enough too, though. He had a temper. And when Steve wasn't working at night, he was usually out playing poker. When he ran out of money, he would try to borrow from someone in the game, even strangers. But Steve's favorite gambling was sports betting, and he was always thinking that he would win big.
Of course, you know that. And the thing with sports betting is you can bet on all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
How many base hits will Carlton Fisk have? What's the over and under on the Lakers-New York Knicks game? And it's all sorts of stuff that you can bet on. So that's a good place to be if you're into gambling. So in December, Elana's watch with a diamond band was reported missing after the Steinbergs had vacationed on Coronado Island in San Diego. Steve told her that she must not have snapped it on tight.
Yeah, then in August of 1980, the Steinbergs went to Lake Tahoe with another couple, the Goldfarbs. And Elana told her friend, Rona Goldfarb, that she didn't want to go because the gambling was just too tempting for Steve. Steve promised her that he wouldn't gamble on the trip, but then one night in Reno, he lost $1,200 in just 10 minutes. So for the first time, Steve and Elana had an argument in front of other people. Their facade was cracking. After returning to Phoenix, Steve reported to his insurance agent that there had been a burglary at their hotel room on the trip, and that some of Elana's jewelry had been taken. So counting the watch that was reported stolen in Coronado, he was paid $1,700. This was the 3rd theft report Steve had made on Elana's jewelry over the years. And that fall, Barney and Edith Singer's townhouse was burglarized, while Edith was in the hospital having a heart bypass. The only signs of forced entry were in a bathroom window, the police said, but they just didn't see how anyone could have fit through such a small window. It really was a mystery. Then there was a change in Elana, and people who knew her well began to notice it. She became anxious pretty much all of the time.
She's got to be wondering where this money's going.
Oh, she knows where it's going, don't you think?
Yeah, and
she's just worried about how they're going to survive.
Right. And she probably figured when her parents' townhouse was burglarized, knowing deep down inside of her that her husband was responsible for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Must have been difficult.
I don't know how deep down you had to go. It was kind of obvious, I would think.
Yeah, but still she's got to put up the facade.
Absolutely, she did. Then competition for the singer's restaurants began to grow, and, summer in Phoenix was a terrible time for the business. Mitchell had spent money remodeling and decorating the Derby, and there were some huge cost overruns. There was little or no capital, so the payback to the leaseholder and the restaurant supply people was dependent on the business. So Mitchell's debts were mounting. He had borrowed $100,000 from a supplier and had given the supplier a mortgage on his house. He had borrowed another large sum from a landlord. So everything at the Brass Derby was running at a deficit from the very beginning. So none of the family were really good business people. Steve just made it worse. The restaurant that Steve managed had never had a profitable month, but no one in the family seemed to be willing to analyze the problem and maybe see that it was time for Steve to go work somewhere else. They couldn't see it.
Just couldn't. In March, Mitchell could see there was no way to go on. He asked Steve to call David Goldfarb and see if he could find a buyer. Now, Goldfarb quickly found Abe and Billy Platt, a father and son from New York. One of the Platts took a look at Steve behind the bar watching a basketball game and laid down the law to Mitch. That's a gambler. You can't have a gambler working back there. I've seen them steal the fillings out of their mother's teeth.
It's true. It's a lot like a drug addict, really.
The Platts were going to buy into the restaurants, but Steve would have to give up the Mark II and work 6 days a week. Well, Steve declined. He didn't like the Platts, and he could see that they didn't like him. A week later, Steve told Mitchell he was leaving and that Elana had agreed, but she had actually wanted him to stay, even if he had to tolerate humiliation. He'd stay at least anyway until he had another job.
And that doesn't seem like too much to ask. You should definitely stay at your job until you find another. But Steve told Elana he wanted to go to real estate school. He signed up for unemployment and took a real estate course at night. But before he left the restaurant for good, guess what? There was a disturbing incident. Edith and Elana were in the Scottsdale restaurant waiting for Steve to go home. He was supposed to be the front man that night, but he was deeply involved in a conversation with 2 men at a table, and Elana was clearly worried. Billy Platt was there watching Steve, and it looked like Steve wasn't working. When Elana asked Steve why he was talking to them, he turned on her and raised his voice. And this was the first time he'd done that in public. He said, "God damn it, shut up, this is serious." So afterward, Edith said it left her with a very uneasy feeling. Those 2 ominous-looking men that night at the restaurant were not the only problem, of course, because one of the banks was closing in and pressing Steve for payment. That loan was $2,000 behind, and a balloon payment was coming due on another. And Steve was avoiding calls from a 3rd bank as well.
Starting to get crushed by this.
Yes, it's really building up.
And that can make you act rather irrationally.
It did make Steve act quite irrationally, yes. So it was in May when Steve made his last big bet before Elana was killed. It was the championship series in the NBA between the Celtics and the Houston Rockets. The Celtics looked unbeatable, but the Rockets were a surprise that year, and Steve felt for sure they would win. So Steve made his bet through Ira Gaines.
Yeah, but when it was all over, the Celtics had won in 6 games, and Steve had lost 4 games in a row and owed Ira $6,200, which he didn't have. So Steve and Elana were getting ready to go to California for his nephew's bar mitzvah, but disaster was just around the corner. On the way, they stopped in Tahoe for the night, and a big argument broke out when Steve started to go to the casino. Elana tried to stand in his way, and he threw her up against the wall. This was a side of Steve that Elana had never seen before. She called Edith as soon as he left the room, and Edith told her to call the police.
Yeah, but she didn't, and by the next day it was forgotten. Steve had come back into the room with their trip money, for the most part intact. In California, the bar mitzvah for Gloria's son went well. Steve took pictures of Elana and the girls that week, laughing and happy, on a cable car in San Francisco. Elana called her mother from Gloria's house and told Edith that she just loved California. Steve said nothing about his precarious financial position to Gloria or her husband, and when they returned home, Steve's friend Ira was after him for the money he owed. First Federal Bank was calling, and Steve was avoiding those calls too. On May 26th, the paper ran a story about the Supreme Court taking up the appeal of Jeffrey McDonald, and the article described how the Green Beret doctor had told police that hippies with long hair had come into his home and stabbed his wife and daughters as they slept. Now Elana put that paper on the coffee table in their den. So Steve saw that article, if that means anything. That morning, Steve picked up his first unemployment check, and for him that was very humiliating.
But he might be getting a little more resentful of his wife.
A little bit, yes. So Steve played baseball that evening, but according to his friends there, he seemed very preoccupied. When Steve got home that night, the house was quiet. Steve's stepbrother Joel called, and that conversation ended with Joel asking about the money Steve had borrowed from him 6 years earlier and still owed him.
At midnight, in her brick house on Via de Luz, Pawa Anandam was up hemming curtains in her family room when she heard a woman screaming, followed by a man's voice raised in anger. She went to the sliding glass door and looked out. There was a park behind the back wall, and she heard noise from there quite often. She thought that her neighbors were having a party, and after she didn't hear anything else, she went to bed.
Yeah, about 1 mile away, David and Rona Goldfarb had just fallen asleep. The Steinbergs were their closest friends. It was 5 past midnight when their ringing phone woke them up, and Rona Goldfarb answered, since the telephone was on her side of the bed. She heard a man's voice screaming, "Rona, come over right away, right now," and then the man hung up. But Rona didn't recognize the voice. Maybe because she'd just been awakened from a deep sleep, but she knew that something terrible had happened somewhere, and her first thought and that of her husband was their next-door neighbors. So the Goldfarbs threw on their robes and ran to see if everything was all right next door. Those neighbors were still up, and they reassured them that there was nothing wrong. But neither Rona nor David could relax after that call. They knew the call was real, and it was meant for Rona. So they made a second contact with the neighbors next door, this time calling their house. And the neighbors answered the phone and reassured them again that they were okay. So eventually the Goldfarbs went back to bed and fell asleep.
A call came into the Scottsdale Police Department at 12:07. A man screamed, "My wife was just murdered." And they walked into the house. "My God, please, I'm bleeding. I'm trying to stop the bleeding." Then a child's voice took over, screaming hysterically, "This is his daughter. Please hurry. I'm here. I'm Tracy. I'm scared."
Yeah, so the dispatcher tried to keep the child on the phone. In 1981, if a Scottsdale officer lost the caller before he could get an address, there was no way to trace it. At the same time, another dispatcher was sending out a code 3 to cars on patrol. There was a possible dead body on Via de Luz, and the children could be at risk. 3 officers arrived at the Steinberg house on Via de Luz together. A barefoot man in a short bathrobe ran out of the house. Steve Steinberg. He was shouting and waving his arms. "They killed her! They killed my wife!" he shouted. "There are 2 of them. They're gone. They went out the back door and over the fence." He pointed to the back of the house with one hand, and his other hand was wrapped in a towel. When the officers entered, they heard the children screaming. Tracy, the oldest, was on her bed screaming hysterically into a phone. The younger girl was just sitting on the floor in a ball. The hall was long with rooms off to one side. At the end of the hall, the master bedroom door was closed. Steve had left his daughters in the house, and they were terrified. Inside the master bedroom, Elana was slumped over in a blue nightgown, sitting on the floor with one leg crossed under her, leaning against the side of the bed. A huge stain of blood in the middle of the bed dripped off onto the floor in a pool. Red splatters were at the head of the bed in a fan pattern against the wallpaper. Elana was covered with blood, and there were wounds in her arm and her side. Her long auburn hair was swept aside by the pile of stained bedding and a comforter that had fallen on her. On the other side of the room, one drawer to a dresser was pulled out. 3 pairs of underpants were on the floor near a sliding glass door to a patio. The officers checked the closets, and there was no one there. By then the children's screaming had stopped. Outside, an ambulance arrived. Out in the street, Steve pushed an officer aside and ran toward the front door. "You asshole, it's my wife," he screamed at the officer. So he seemed a bit off.
Steve was still barefoot. and in his robe. He had a towel wrapped around a cut on the palm of his hand. He wandered in and out of the rooms, and sometimes he went outside into the street. He cried and complained about the pain in his hand. Some of the people who saw him that night thought he acted dazed. Some thought he was controlled. Once he hit his head against the wall. He seemed hostile, and his reaction seemed off.
That does seem a bit off. Remember Michael Peterson, how he seemed kind of angry at the dispatcher when he was supposedly trying to resuscitate Kathleen Peterson.
Yeah.
So it seems like we've seen that in a few cases. So while the dispatcher had been trying to calm Tracy and keep her on the phone, Steve had been busy on another line in the den. He was calling family and friends. He called Elana's brother Mitch. He called the Goldfarbs. It was him on the call that had alarmed Rona. He even called an acquaintance in the neighborhood, Mike Berkovich, who was really puzzled by that call because Mike didn't know Steve very well. But he had called Mike and yelled, "Come over right away, they've killed Elana and the house has been robbed." Mitch Singer got there before Berkovich. He brought his wife and their baby, and he brought his handgun. Barney and Edith Singer were there because Mitch had called them. Steve's mother Esther and her husband came too, and all of them were hanging around inside the house. There were ambulance attendants in the living room waiting for the detectives to finish in the master bedroom. Elana's father Barney felt faint and actually collapsed. Someone called a doctor to look at him. Steve didn't say much to his wife's family, and he actually avoided Barney Singer's eyes. When Steve talked to Mitch that night, it was just to justify his failure to protect Elana. Mitchell remembers their conversation. He was sitting in the kids' room, and he was very upset that his sister had been stabbed to death, and that Steve had just a little cut on his hand. Then later they were both in the kitchen, and Steve took a drink of water and emptied the water into the sink and said, "Well, there goes 15 years down the drain."
What a guy.
Yeah.
Now, to everyone else in the house that night, Steve talked constantly. He told one friend that two men with long hair and bushy beards had come in through the glass sliding door. He said they were white men, and that both the beards and the hair looked like they were fakes. He expanded the story about the bushy-haired men when talking to Mike Berkovich. When Berkovich got to the house, Steve was sitting on the hall floor looking dazed. He cried a lot, and he told Mike that these two guys came in, and they wanted to know where the jewelry was, and that he got it for them. Then he said that the two men said it wasn't enough. They wanted more. Elana's mother believed the story that Steve was telling everyone, but the Scottsdale police were a little more suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry into the master bedroom. The grass outside was damp from the rain, and there were no footprints on the grass like there should have been if someone had been standing there that night. The gate in the back wall to the park was padlocked, and the picnic table that blocked the gate had never been moved.
Well, the delicate and petite Elana was really no threat to anyone, so why would she be butchered and Steve just have a little scratch on his hand? He wasn't hurt enough for what he said happened, and to the police it was just obvious that Elana had been stabbed in her back and her side while she was still lying in bed, so probably by whoever was in bed with her. The underpants on the bedroom floor were actually laid out neatly, so it looked like there had been no burglars. Steve was rapidly becoming a murder suspect. Although some officers were cruising the neighborhood, there was really no serious manhunt for the two bearded strangers that Steve had described. Police attention was focused on Steve from the beginning. Steve signed a consent to search form. He was sitting on a bed in the children's room. Barney Singer was there along with some other people, just glaring at him. In the master bedroom there were drops of blood on the foot of the bed, which weren't connected to the pool of blood on the floor where Elana's body was slumped over. And, tucked into the hollow of the wooden bed platform under the box spring, they found a large, blood-stained knife. This was a meat-carving knife, the kind you would use for a Thanksgiving turkey. So the Steinberg house was built in a U shape, and it was a very long walk around the U, 66 feet in fact, from the bedroom to the kitchen. In one of the drawers they found the carving knife's matching fork, so they knew the knife came from there. Elana had been killed with a carving knife from her own kitchen.
At autopsy, the coroner found at least 26 separate stab wounds in Elana's body, ranging from 3/4 of an inch to 4 inches in depth. At least 4 stabs had pierced her vital organs: spleen, liver, stomach, and heart. One was in the temporal lobe of her brain, but that wound was post-mortem. At least 4 of the wounds were fatal. Wounds on her arms and hands suggested that she had tried to defend herself. Behind a mirror in the bathroom, there is a pile of jewelry, gold chains, earrings, and a diamond watch. Police wondered why the jewelry was piled up there tucked behind a mirror. Didn't fit with Steve's story at all. But it did fit with their theory of what happened. It was their belief that Steve was going to take the jewelry and say it was a burglar.
Yeah, so something happened to prevent him from doing the whole jewelry claim thing, and we're not sure how that worked out. But Steve was first taken to the hospital, and his palm was stitched up in the emergency room. The cut was not serious. There was no nerve or tendon damage. Taking his fingerprints had to wait until his palm healed, but the emergency room doctor took fingernail scrapings and blood samples. From the hospital, it was just a few yards to the police building, and Steve was taken there to be interviewed that same night. Steve said he wanted to talk to the police, and as he talked, his story went from improbable to completely unbelievable. Steve told the police that it had been a peaceful night on Via de Luz. He had played in a softball game in Paradise Valley, taking Sean, his daughter, with him. Elana and Edith Singer had taken Tracy to a school concert at Kiva School. Tracy played the flute. So everyone was home by 10 o'clock, and Elana went to bed early. The last he heard from his wife was when she asked him to open the sliding glass doors to let the breeze in. When he went to bed, Elana was almost asleep and the glass door was open. Steve told the police that he woke up to Elana screaming, "Steve, Tracy, Sean!" And there were 2 men in the room bending over Elana, he said. Then he felt a weight on his chest. He said one man held him down while the other stabbed Elana over and over again. No explanation for why they would stab this woman to death and just let him go. But by this time, the detectives had already talked to Mitchell Singer and had learned more about Steve's world that was falling apart. They were told that he was a heavy gambler, that he was in a financial mess because of gambling losses, and that Mitch was selling the restaurants to New York investors who didn't want Steve to stay on working there. They heard that Steve had taken out loans to pay gambling debts that his wife didn't know about, and that the safe at the Brass Derby restaurant had been looted. A detective told Steve that he was going to be arrested and charged, and for the first time, Steve seemed visibly upset. He asked to see a lawyer. Daughters Tracy and Sean had gone home with Edith and Barney Singer. Poor Edith was in a daze. She stumbled and fell while getting into the car. Before she left the house, Edith cleaned up the glasses of water and said, "My daughter likes a neat house." Through the rest of the night, Edith and Barney and Mitch Singer waited at the Singer's house for Steve to come back from the police station. They had no idea that he would be arrested that night. Edith and Mitch still believed in the burglar story, but Barney knew better. In recalling that night, Barney said that Steve's avoidance of him convinced him that his son-in-law had killed Elana.
The Steinbergs did not match the kind of marriage where such violence happened. However, a careful observer could find a vulnerable flaw in the marriage. They had been living a fragile existence for years. Elana had seen glimpses of the dark side of Steve's nature at the end, but her marriage and her family were everything to her, and she didn't want to recognize the danger she could be in. Edith and Barney Singer sat Shiva. These are the 7 days of ritual mourning for the dead. For that week, the mourners do not work, not even to prepare food. Mourners don't wear shoes, and they sit on low stools. All the mirrors in the house are covered, and the door to the Shiva house is left ajar. Friends that call let themselves in and out so that the family is not distracted. There's a pitcher of water outside the door for callers to symbolically wash away the touch of death and the graveyard before they enter the Shiva house.
So when Steve was arrested, the jail was overcrowded and dark. Sometimes there were 8 men in one holding cell. So for someone as accustomed to luxury as Steve, this must have felt very extreme. But he adapted surprisingly well, and he had many visitors. The first day after Elana was killed, 8 people came to the jail to see him. He told everyone that he believed the bearded strangers had stabbed Elana until the truth was finally revealed to him weeks later by a string of dreams, he said. The singers had immediately become his enemy. Steve's family had retained the very best attorneys. Arizona's leading criminal defense attorney was generally considered to be Robert Hirsch. So Hirsch was from Tucson, 100 miles away from Phoenix, but his practice was all over Arizona. He was not infallible and had some losses in the past, but overall, Bob Hirsch's trial record was very impressive. His specialty was the romantic homicide. In these killings, the victim is killed by a spouse or by a lover who's been rejected. Hirsch's technique in these cases was a temporary insanity defense that he had really polished to perfection. Hirsch had been successful in gaining acquittals in several romantic homicides by using an insanity defense, even though these clients had no history of mental illness. So reporters called him the miracle worker. His first temporary insanity defense to get public attention was a case where he successfully defended a Tucson woman who shot her husband as he was getting ready to leave her with his graduate degree in his hand. But usually Hirsch's murder clients were men committing vicious crimes against women. So Hirsch told Steve that his would be a two-man trial. He had the help of a Phoenix defense attorney named Mike Benchoff. Like Hirsch, he was a brilliant lawyer and let no details pass him by. It took several days for Steve's family to settle on hiring Hirsch. When Edith Singer went to the house the day after the murder to get clothing for Tracy and Sean, she found that all the locks had already been changed. Now, by law, all of Elana's possessions, bank accounts, and real estate now belonged to Steve. The title had gone to him at the time of Elana's death, and unless he was convicted of her murder, all of Elana's property was Steve's, and he needed her assets to finance his defense.
After the murder, the Steinberg family rallied to support Steve. His sister Gloria was the most important because she was willing to put up money for Steve's defense. Well, 5 days after the murder, Steve signed a $75,000 deed of trust to his sister, secured by the house on Via Duluth. In that summer of 1981, Hirsch had 2 murder trials to defend at the same time, and both of them were going to require a lot of effort to save his clients. A month after Elana Steinberg was killed, a contractor named William Gorzensky shot and killed 2 people in the small Arizona town of Safford. The evidence was not promising for a defense attorney. Gorzensky's wife Sandra had filed for divorce. Then the jealous Gorzensky stalked her for days, looking through windows where Sandra worked, and also he was drinking to excess. On the night of the murders, footprints showed that Gorzensky had watched his estranged wife and her date through a window. Then he left to get his gun. Sandra Gorzensky and a public works director were blown to pieces with a shotgun as Sandra cowered and tried to shield herself. Bill Gorzensky calmly helped himself to a beer from the murdered man's refrigerator while he waited for the sheriff to show up.
So it seemed a cut-and-dry conviction for first-degree murder.
Sure did.
Gorzensky's lawyer in Safford knew that he had serious problems, and he called Bob Hirsch. Gorzensky could afford it. The Steinberg and Gorzensky cases would be tried back-to-back, and both trials would have to be prepared for at the same time. Steve Steinberg was part of a society that Hirsch could understand, but Gorzensky was different. He lived in a town isolated at the base of the Pinaleno Mountains in southern Arizona. Hirsch would adjust his language and his wardrobe to fit that society so that William Gorzensky's witnesses would feel comfortable with his defense attorney. And Hirsch knew that both trials couldn't be defended successfully just on the evidence. He would rely on temporary insanity. Hirsch's favorite psychiatrist, Dr. Martin Blinder, could do the workup for both defendants in one trip from San Francisco. So on August 31st, Dr. Blinder arrived in Phoenix, and he saw Steinberg in the jail. Then on the next day, Hirsch drove him to interview Gorzensky in the Graham County Jail. Blinder diagnosed the same condition for both men, dissociative reaction. That's a close cousin of multiple personality disorder. Hirsch then brought in Diane Lindstrom, a tall blonde female attorney, to make the first contact with the Steinberg friends in Scottsdale. She came to their home smiling and friendly, describing how Steve and the children really needed their help, and if they were receptive, next was a meeting with Bob Hirsch. So most people had heard of Hirsch, and many of them found it exciting to be a part of this defense project. and the defense began by having group meetings in the evenings in Scottsdale. These meetings were reinforcing witnesses who were committing themselves to helping Steve. Even the rabbi from the Reformed congregation was at the first meeting, which almost made it seem as if God was on Steve's side. But prosecutor Jeff Hotham thought that Steve Steinberg could call in 100 friends as character witnesses, and it wouldn't help him get off. He couldn't have been more wrong, though. The police had interviewed everyone Steve called on the telephone on the night of the murder. They had Steve's fingerprints identified on the carving knife in blood. There just didn't seem to be anything to worry about. But when Hirsch talked to Steve's friends, he talked about the children, Sean and Tracy, and how they really needed their father now more than ever because their mother was dead. When the insanity plea came out in the open and everyone began to realize that Steve actually had killed Elana, Hirsch spoke about how Steve would get medical treatment if he was acquitted, and then the children wouldn't be orphans. The children should have their father some reason, no matter what had happened. So the defense team picked who to have testify for them with discrimination. Hirsch would discard a witness who seemed too eager or even the least bit unpredictable. Hirsch's strategy was to separate the friends who were on their side into a very cohesive group. These people were so committed that they disregarded Elana's murder in order to defend Steve. It was really remarkable. So here are some of the questions asked of those so-called character witnesses. Did Elana pressure Steve to make money? Did Elana spend a lot of money and was Steve upset about it? Did Elana have a lot of clothes? Was money important to Elana? So these are just ridiculous to me. Money's important to everyone. Every wife under financial stress would pressure their husband to make money.
Sure.
It's just ridiculous.
So after sitting Shiva, Barney and Edith and the girls were left alone. The singers were fearful that Steve would get to the girls and steal them away. The girls were seeing a psychologist. Tracy once thought her father could come through the water pipes while she was taking a shower. She had heard him washing his hands that night when her mother was killed. Edith was not easy to be with either. She cried all the time and was consumed with anger and said terrible things about Steve.
Well, justifiably so.
Well, yeah, he killed her daughter.
You're right. But, people just weren't very sympathetic about that. They were more sympathetic towards Steve.
Got to be a great salesman.
Yes, I think he was. Well, and so was his attorney.
Yeah, the friends who became a part of Steve's defense were so easy to channel into Steve's defense. There seemed to be little introspection or objectivity. They couldn't discuss the dilemma in which they found themselves with an objective outsider. They became locked in. Elana had made some enemies, and they were unrelenting. So we're going to get all these people up there to tell us what a horrible woman the dead person is.
Yeah, it's victim blaming. So choosing experts for an insanity trial like Steve Steinberg's had to be done carefully, and Bob Hirsch knew how to do it. He wouldn't hire a psychiatrist if he wasn't hearing what he wanted to hear. A certain result was expected, and he knew just who to hire. So Hirsch wasn't relying on Dr. Blinder alone. He retained a second psychiatrist for Steve. In the beginning of September, about 3 months after Elana was killed, Dr. Donald Holmes arrived in Phoenix to examine Hirsch's client. Holmes was the director of a community mental health clinic in Casa Grande, a small cotton town in the center of the state. Dr. Holmes had a distinguished background in psychiatry. He was a professor at the University of Michigan, had written a textbook, and had graduated summa cum laude from medical school. Unlike Martin Blinder, Dr. Holmes was not a true forensic psychiatrist. Though Blinder was on the cutting edge of the insanity defense, Holmes was the defense psychiatrist who was going to break new ground. After Dr. Holmes talked to Steven Steinberg, he said that Hirsch's client had been in a deep sleep when he went and got the carving knife from the Steinberg kitchen, and when he killed his wife. He was a sleepwalker, and a homicidal sleepwalker to boot. Although Dr. Holmes described Steinberg's state as sleepwalking, both Holmes and Blinder found that Steve Steinberg was in a dissociative reaction when he killed his wife Elana. It's what they both called an altered state of consciousness. Dissociation is one of the hysterical neuroses, defined as a sudden alteration in mental functioning. At trial, Steve's defense would claim he was sleepwalking and was not sane at the time of the murder, and Dr. Martin Blinder would tell the jury that the repeated stabbing of Elana was due to Steinberg being in a state of dissociative reaction. So you might think nobody would buy that, but you'd be wrong.
You would think that that sounds like bull.
Well, and I don't think it would work again. I don't think it would work today. But it was just the way things came together in this case.
So on February 2nd, 1982, jury selection began. 45 people were questioned by the judge. Then each of the lawyers took their 10 peremptory challenges. These challenges can be exercised for any reason that an attorney chooses. He may just have vague misgivings about a particular juror. He may strike a juror because of the stereotypes about what certain occupations and age types are likely to do. Women tend to be prejudiced against other women, particularly if the other woman is pretty. Avoid engineers and accountants if you're a defense attorney because they tend to be too fact-based and analytical.
Yeah, in the end, everyone who had said that they had seen a sleepwalker did not make it on the jury. All but one of the 9 jurors who had been to college was gone as well. Were gone as well. So for the most part, businessmen, professionals, and decision-makers were missing from this jury. The panel consisted of housewives, retired military personnel, and workers for businesses like the electric and phone companies. Naive and non-assertive jurors were generally preferred by the defense. There were 9 women, because by tradition women would tend to sympathize with or even feel motherly toward the handsome Steve, and be critical of his dead wife. On the other hand, there were 3 military men, and they were supposed to be more prosecution-minded. But when the trial began, Steve Steinberg sat between his attorneys, Hirsch and Benchoff, and he had lost 20 pounds in jail. He was also very pale. The clothes he was wearing would have surprised anyone who had known him before. He wore an inexpensive business suit, a button-down Oxford shirt, and a knit tie. These were not the kind of clothes that Steve liked. He normally had worn silk shirts open at the chest with gold chains. Edith Singer said that Steve had always loved flashy clothes. But then Steve would blame Elana for the offensive clothes. She bought all my clothes. She picked them out. I didn't have anything to do with it, he said. So someone was sent out to Sears to buy 2 outfits so that Steve could alternate them at his trial. They were conservative and humble. Elana Steinberg was portrayed in the trial as a professional shopper at Saks and Nordstrom, but her husband's clothes were to confirm that she hadn't spent any money on him. So Prosecutor Hotham should have known the strategy that the reports revealed. His plan of attack was to show how brutal the crime was, and that the insanity defense was a complete fraud. But Elana Steinberg would be the real focus of this trial. She was going to be portrayed as a nagging shrew, and her husband Steve, a long-suffering, saintly man, compelled to kill because of her spending. I can't even say that without laughing. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But people bought it.
They apparently did, and not just in this trial.
No, it's not the only one.
So in opening arguments, Hotham said that the case was really quite simple, but at the same time very tragic and ugly. He described how Steve Steinberg had taken a 9.5-inch knife from a kitchen drawer, went into the bedroom, and brutally butchered his young wife as she lay sleeping in her bed. He stabbed her at least 25 times. He stabbed her in the head. He stabbed her in the chest. He stabbed her in the back. He cut into her liver, her spleen, her stomach, her lungs, and her brain. Hotham promised that he would have psychiatric testimony contradicting the defense experts because the defendant was completely sane when he killed his wife. Prosecutor did not mention a motive.
Yeah, if he planned to kill Elana, as Hotham said, was it rage or hatred for her after 15 years of marriage? Was it because Elana was standing in the way of his gambling? Or had she confronted him with the disappearance of money from the safe at B.B. Singer's? The prosecutor was not prepared to speculate about any of these motives, and that was a big issue in this case. In his opening statement, Hirsch told a story about nagging wives and credit cards and restaurants in Scottsdale and decorator wallpaper and a meddling mother-in-law. The villains were a bitchy wife and a brother-in-law boss. The hero was the killer, a simple man who put his humble background behind him for his greedy in-laws. On this jury, there were people who thought in biblical terms and had never hired an interior decorator. The way Hirsch told it, Steve was a man pushed to the brink by forces beyond his control, a man just like any of them. He had worked 10 to 14 hours a day just to support his wife and his family.
Elana was described as a superficial, materialistic, demanding woman. Hirsch had his witnesses friends of Steve, who had no problem blaming the victim. He said that Steve's gambling had begun recently, and it was Steve's way to earn money for his demanding wife.
Oh my God.
In order to get more money to provide for the house and his family, not for himself, he started to gamble. Everyone knew Steve gambled, and when Steve won, it was great. He was encouraged to win and bring home the money. The procedure was that he would give it to Elana, and she would take it from there. This is just, hindsight's wonderful, but this is just unbelievable.
Isn't it awful? Hirsch even pointed out the complete absence of any statement by the prosecutor for any potential motive in the case. Now, in a murder trial, we know the state is not required to find a motive and prove it, and the jury is given an instruction to that effect. But the reality of a murder trial is, of course, different. If the prosecution does not at least suggest some motive, it's very difficult to get a conviction. Generally, one of the strong points for the prosecution in a brutal killing is the testimony of the medical examiner and the effect of the autopsy photos that are shown. The photos of Elana in death are notable because they show the healthy skin of a young woman, her cotton nightie pushed aside, and the horrible position of one leg beneath her. The stab wounds were terrible. A close-up of her fingernails broken to the quick shows how she struggled for her life. But at the time of the Steinberg trial, prosecutors had to use the medical examiner assigned to each murder. So for an outside medical examiner to be brought in, extreme reasons would have to be presented, and they weren't. So it really was bad luck for the prosecutor when he got Dr. Thomas Jarvis for Elana's autopsy. Tom Jarvis was an older man who'd been working on cadavers in a secluded medical atmosphere for many years, and he didn't hesitate to assert his independence from the prosecutor. Dr. Jarvis was independent in his testimony in the murder trial. He testified that of the 26 stab wounds, 4 were potentially fatal. 1 penetrated the lung and the inferior vena cava, the large vein leading to the heart, and Jarvis said that this was instantly fatal. Another went through the spleen and stomach, and a third was inflicted through the back and went in through the kidney. A fourth was thrust down through the diaphragm and into her liver. Any one or a combination of the 4 could have been fatal, but Dr. Jarvis referred to the rest of the wounds as being superficial, and that's a word which had a different meaning to this medical examiner than it would to the jury. To Dr. Jarvis, superficial meant that the stab wound terminated in fat or ended when it hit a bone without penetrating an organ. As Dr. Jarvis said about the remaining 22 stab wounds, they generally terminated on bone, and that's what stopped them. The last of the stabs had gone through her skull and penetrated her right temporal lobe of her brain, and that wound was potentially fatal too, said Dr. Jarvis. But by this time, Elana Steinberg's blood pressure had dropped, and she was either dead or near dead. The police theory was that Steinberg's hand slid down the knife when it hit Elana's skull, and it was at that point that his hand was cut. The print of an index finger was on the handle of the knife, and a palm print was on the blade, and both were in blood. So you think that would be enough, but it certainly wasn't.
When the jurors were interviewed later by the author of Death of a Jewish American Princess, Shirley Frondorf, none of them had understood that the skull had to be penetrated to reach the brain. The brutality of this was difficult to fit with the idea of sleepwalking. Hirsch argued that Steve had grasped the knife by the blade instead of the handle throughout the attack because he was in an altered state of consciousness. He turned the knife into evidence of insanity. No one in their right mind would grasp a knife like this, Hirsch argued.
Well, Hotham attempted to discuss this with Jarvis before the trial, but he really got no cooperation. To discount the testimony, the prosecutor needed a medical witness who would testify that it was ridiculous to think that Steinberg held the knife by the blade while he was stabbing his wife. I mean, can you even imagine?
Just simple measuring. A knife that has a 9-inch blade, if you're holding it in the palm of your hand, it's 4 inches at least, and wounds were deeper than that.
Well, that's one thing, but the blade on that knife was almost 10 inches long, and it was razor sharp. So if he'd made 26 stab wounds, most of them stopped by a bone, with his hand wrapped around the blade while someone was fighting him off?
Yeah, he'd really do a job on his hand.
Yeah, his hand would have been shredded.
Instead of one
little cut. But Steinberg did have just this single cut on his palm, and nobody seemed to really question that, at least not in the jury. Dr. Jarvis had seen 800 stabbings in his career, but inexplicably, he equivocated when asked the question about this. Doctor, that laceration on the hand that we looked at could also be consistent with the person grasping the knife down on the blade and then hitting the body or some object, would it not? Hirsch asked him in cross. And inexplicably, Dr. Jarvis said that it could have been either that the hand was on the handle of the blade when it hit the body, or when it hit the body it slipped down, or the hand was grasping on the bottom of the blade and then causing the wounds. Hirsch also wanted to have Jarvis say the wounds were shallow, and that fit in with his blade theory. Dr. Jarvis had gone as far as he could on this, but it was an enormous boost for the defense, because Jarvis said he didn't like that theory very much, but it was possible. And the physical evidence is consistent with it, Dr. Jarvis said, really just destroying the prosecution's case.
Several jurors would say later that Steinberg had just been playing with Elana, just making little pinpricks, and he hadn't meant to hurt her. And this is all from the Jarvis testimony. But this could have been just a way for some of the jurors to rationalize their sympathy for Steve, because the doctor's testimony downplayed the violence done to Elana.
Yeah, when it was time for the defense witnesses, Dr. Holmes was called to the stand, and he set up the villains in the case immediately. His testimony attacked Elana and her parents without mercy. After his interview with Steve Steinberg in the jail in August of 1981, Dr. Holmes had written a devastating report, and in this report he said that Steve had had a happy, warm childhood. His mother was warm and loving. His sister Gloria was wonderful. His stepbrother and sister, Steinberg said, were right here when I needed them. Dr. Holmes was allowed as an expert to testify from his report, and he explained it in just kind of a free narrative. This way, all of Steve's assessments of people and events appeared to be those of Dr. Holmes himself. The doctor was no longer a critical observer. The possibility that a man in jail awaiting trial may be speaking in his own self-interest or to avoid blame had apparently never crossed this doctor's mind. And as he testified, the psychiatrist dropped descriptive words like, "He told me," and the jury was left with the impression that the doctor had adopted Steve's descriptions of Elana and the Singer family as his own. Now Steve's own opinions were treated as medical proof. Holmes had accepted everything that Steve told him because he said Steve was honest, and he knew this, he told the jury, because he was a doctor.
Trust me, I'm a doctor. Elana was a lavish spender, and Steve gambled to liquidate his debts, which he incurred with her credit cards. Steve did not use them, Holmes said. She was oblivious or utterly uncaring about their financial realities. When Steve asked for her discretion in her spending, she responded with angry, redoubled demands that he make more money. This is all information from the physician. He has tremendous insight. Steinberg loved his own family dearly, said Dr. Holmes, until he was seduced away from them by his wife and in-laws, who are all very materialistic, and who called his mother and stepfather stingy and cheap. Although Steinberg had joined the Singers in their materialism, Holmes said that now Steve wanted to return to the simple life of his parents. He knew that he had made a mistake. Elana Steinberg was an absolutely uncaring spendthrift who paid no attention to financial realities. Whenever Steve tried to explain to her that they didn't have enough money for one thing or another, said Dr. Holmes, she would go out and shop for a new car or a new house or new clothing, running up heavy bills on credit cards.
Yeah, Dr. Holmes said he didn't think Steve ever could have earned enough money to make Elana content. In his story, everyone else did bad things or manipulated the helpless Steve Steinberg. For the first time, the phrase Jewish American princess was heard in the courtroom, and it came from Steve Steinberg through Dr. Holmes. The doctor seemed somewhat mystified by the fact that Steinberg would use that phrase for his wife, because he seemed amazed that Steve didn't hate his wife, like he should have. Not only was Elana a princess, but then even Tracy was stereotyped. Tracy was a good student, but a PIT, a princess in training, he said. The psychiatrist said that Steve was worried that the girls were living with the singers because they would spoil them and bring them up the way they did Elana. Are you ready to throw up yet? Because I am. I just can't believe this really happened.
I know. It's like you're in another world.
Yes.
Dr. Holmes said that he was positive, beyond any medical doubt, that Steve was completely asleep and unconscious when he walked to the kitchen to get the carving knife and then came back and stabbed his wife 26 times. According to the psychiatrist, the defendant was probably awakened by Elana's screams. He was in a confused state then, when he hid the knife under the box spring and threw the underwear out of the drawer. The attempts to clean up the scene and create a fake burglary, said Holmes, were denial, a psychotic, not a guilty reaction.
Well, there was a problem with the defense by Dr. Holmes, which somehow evaded the jurors. Because either Steve was asleep and unconscious, or his wife was a terrible person who made him kill. You wouldn't think you could have it both ways. But according to Dr. Holmes, that wasn't a problem. It was possible to be aimlessly sleepwalking and aim Elana at the same time. It was sleepwalking with a purpose.
I like that. Multitask sleepwalking.
Yeah. Now, in the end, the jury believed the defense of sleepwalking, and although they knew that Steve had committed the murder, they felt they had no choice but to find him not guilty because he wasn't consciously aware and rational when he carried out the murder. Although he was found not guilty on the basis of being insane at the time of the murder, it gets worse because he was then deemed to be sane at the time of the trial, and therefore he wasn't even sent to a psychiatric hospital. He was found not guilty and he was free to go.
He can walk.
And because Elana's parents were actually witnesses at the trial, they didn't see all of this. So it was quite shocking to them in the end.
I can only imagine.
If Steve's family thought that he would stay at home on the night of his acquittal, they were wrong about that. That night he went out and celebrated. Steve actually made the rounds of Scottsdale restaurants and nightclubs. His celebratory evening did not go unnoticed either. At least one man remembered an unfriendly atmosphere when Steve arrived on a scene. He described a cold feeling in the room. At one of the restaurants, a former singer employee working at the bar said he saw something different in Steve and he didn't like what he saw. Everyone that was there didn't know what to say to him, and he showed no remorse at all. He said the only thing that he regretted was that he'd had to stay in jail for 9 months. Then Steve walked up to a woman who was sitting at the bar and he put his hands on her breasts. Then he laughed and he said something about being in jail for so long. So I guess that made it okay.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever sympathy everyone had for Steve really evaporated that night. And for Elana's brother, Mitch Singer, the whole night was just a terrible insult. I can't even imagine.
So Steve called Edith Singer, and in the conversation with Elana's own mother, he marveled at the odds he had beaten with his verdict. Do you know how many times that could happen? Edith's son-in-law asked her happily. Edith was floored by his complete lack of empathy or accountability. He just wanted to tell her how lucky he was. Last thing she wants to hear.
Yeah, but didn't even really seem to have any feelings about that. That's Elana's mother.
No, it was kind of like, okay, too bad.
Right. And then 3 days after the Steinberg verdict, Hirsch moved on to Safford for the Gorzensky trial. Less than 3 weeks later, the Gorzensky verdict was in. The jury found Gorzensky not guilty by reason of insanity. Hirsch's trial technique was again to try the victim, as he had so successfully tried Elana Steinberg. The dead Sandra Gorzensky caused her husband to snap, said Dr. Donald Holmes, by her flagrant act of infidelity in going out with another man before her divorce was finalized. It was another win for Hirsch and his 2 psychiatrists.
Steinberg signed custody of both his daughters over to Elana's parents, where they would have the chance of a normal upbringing and a more stable life. Not long after the verdict, he moved away from the Phoenix area. After the Steinberg case, the state amended the law to bring the burden of proof onto the defendant, who would need to serve jail time at a state-run secure hospital, even if they were considered guilty but insane. When the legislature changed the insanity law, it was a direct result of the Steinberg verdict. It's the one good thing that came out of it, Prosecutor Jeff Hotham said.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the frustration of the prosecution or the feelings of Elana's family. Your daughter is murdered, brutally murdered, and then she's torn apart at trial like she's a bad person. It's just the worst ever. The worst thing ever.
Well, were there any comments about the prosecution? Were they considered adequate or that they dropped the ball?
No, I think they did drop the ball in some ways. Of course, they had much fewer resources, though. Like I said, they were stuck with the medical examiner who was assigned to the case. They couldn't go out and pay for one. So they did have some...
That was just a financial decision.
Yeah, that's just the way the rules worked there. They didn't have the budget to go out and do that. And I think part of the problem is that Hotham just thought this was an open and shut case, which is kind of understandable.
One would think so.
Exactly. You really can't blame him for thinking that. It's just a crazy thing. And it seems like now it wouldn't happen, hopefully. We can hope that that would not be repeated. But just victimizing the victim. We know this happened years ago, especially with women who are raped or sexually assaulted. It still happens, unfortunately, in those cases. But this one is just so extreme. It's amazing. An amazing story. So thank you, Jessica. It's a shocking story.
It sure is.
And I really don't have a very good feeling about these jurors. They do seem kind of idiotic, in my opinion. I don't understand a juror that would go along with this. But, I wasn't on the jury, so what can I say?
Yeah, we don't know.
We don't know, but certainly not justice. I can say that.
No question.
No question. Okay, well, let's do a little feedback.
It's time for listener feedback.
So first of all, we have a voicemail from Eris.
Hi, Jill and Dick. My name is Eris, and I am a longtime TCB listener. I've been listening almost from the beginning. I believe I came across TCB and started listening when you had probably a handful of episodes, and I have liked it from the very beginning. I appreciate how thoroughly and respectfully you two cover cases, and I like that you lend personal and professional insight into cases whenever possible. And I usually learn something, even when it's a case that I consider myself to be pretty familiar with. I am from California, specifically Northern California, and I was born in Oakland. And even though I haven't lived in the Bay Area in quite a while, I still go often and am quite interested in the happenings there. This case took place in San Francisco, and it's from the 70s, 73, 74, a little bit older than me, not to age myself, but it's referred to as the Zebra Killings, and it involved 4 Black men, and their race is relevant because this was a racially motivated crime. They were allegedly trying to start a race war. They killed over a dozen people. During the course of the investigation, before they were caught, the mayor of San Francisco at the time instituted a stop and frisk policy. People may be familiar with that more recently with Mayor Giuliani in like the 90s with New York City. And that led to some violations of people's rights, as those types of policies tend to, and a federal judge had to step in and put a stop to that. Anyways, that's the case suggestion. I also have, I'm not big on beer, but there is a local place, Alameda Island Brewing, that both myself and my partner are fans of, and I like fruity flavor profiles. So my go-to there is Tell Me When to Mango. And it's a play on a song by a Bay Area rapper. It's a wheat beer, so it's quite filling. I usually just have 1 pint. Whenever we go, it's 5% ABV. And my guy, he likes Pilsner. His go-to is Big Paddle Pills, and it's 5% ABV as well. Anyways, Happy New Year and look forward to possibly hearing this covered. Bye.
Thank you, Eris. Nice voicemail. I don't know if I can really add much to that. She's very thorough.
Yeah, I looked up just to get a quick idea. I'd heard of the case, but I didn't have a ton of information. They may have been responsible for up to 70 deaths.
Wow.
But just don't know.
Right.
So it might be an interesting case to look up.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to. I don't think I've ever heard of it, actually. So I'll look into that. Any comments on the beers? They've got great names.
They have wonderful names. That's what I want to do in my new life, is be a namer of beers.
You could do that. I don't think you need a new life. You just start doing it.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
But no, I haven't tried any of the beers from that particular brewery.
Okay, well, let's try some beers and look up that case.
Okay.
All right. So we do have an email I'm going to read. This is from Megan B. And it's kind of close to my heart because it's something I've been thinking about recently. And that is the Casey Anthony situation where George and Cindy Anthony recently took lie detector tests. So Megan writes, I read that Casey Anthony's parents feel vindicated by the lie detector tests they both passed in a recent documentary. They're really happy that the truth came out, and I feel happy for them to get some relief. Believe it or not, some people believed Casey, and Cindy and George have been harassed since the 2008 murder of their granddaughter Kaylee. They told the truth, and now everyone knows that it's the truth, and that the only liar when it comes to the case is Casey. Seems obvious to me, but I guess it wasn't to everyone. Cindy and George were in A&E's documentary, Casey Anthony's Parents, The Lie Detector Test, earlier this month. The show includes footage of George and Cindy hooked up to a polygraph while answering difficult questions about circumstances surrounding the disappearance and death of 2-year-old Kaylee more than 15 years ago. During the show, George again refuted Casey's claim that he had sexually abused her and Kaylee and that he was responsible for Kaylee's death. Casey had also alleged that it was George who disposed of Kaylee's body in a wooded area near the house. And hallelujah, at the end of the special, the Anthonys were told that they passed the test and their answers were truthful. Supposedly, when she saw the conclusion of the show, Casey threw a fit, a friend told a reporter. She keeps talking about how much bullshit the whole thing was, her friend said. She's in full meltdown mode. And now, says the source, Casey is considering a rebuttal of her parents' documentary. It would be another chapter in the horrible story of Casey Anthony, who was 21 in 2008 when her daughter went missing. She never reported Kaylee's disappearance. Instead, Cindy called the police a month later after getting the runaround about her granddaughter's whereabouts. Authorities began investigating and found physical evidence that Kaylee's body had been in the back of her mom's car. Then Casey was charged with first-degree murder. But during the 2011 trial, Casey claimed that her father was responsible for disposing of Kaylee's body and that she had been afraid to speak up because George had sexually abused her for years. On the stand, George forcefully denied the claims, and after Casey was acquitted, questions about the truthfulness remained. Casey repeated the allegations in Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, which was Peacock's 3-part series that debuted last year. But now her parents passed a lie detector test, and there's no way Casey will do that unless her sketchy lawyer friend arranges a fake one. So I agree with you, Megan, and I think as far as this documentary, it was really not only eye-opening in the lie detector results, but just in the relationship between George and Cindy. You can really see two very damaged people. And I think way back when we covered this case, we could see that it was a dysfunctional family, and a lot of that dysfunction revolved around Casey. Denial. As far as her pregnancy, who the father of her baby was, just so much. And then when it finally did go to trial, I do think that Cindy lied on the stand to defend Casey, saying that she was the one who had looked up chloroform on the internet, that she was trying to look up something else, and said she was trying to look up chlorophyll.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. So, but just, I feel so bad for these people. I always have. And to see that they really are damaged people. And even during the documentary, we see Cindy have an anxiety attack. And even though they're pretty dysfunctional, lots of issues, it was heartwarming to me to see how George actually comforted her. Just imagine what they've been living with.
Oh, how can you?
I just don't know. I mean,
Plus, they never moved from their house. So.
No, they've been harassed. Absolutely. And I think that Cindy is just very, she's stuck. She has pictures of Kaylee and Casey all over the house. I think she was just a very devoted mother. Her whole personality was based on being a mother and a grandmother.
Yes.
She was probably much more of a mother to Kaylee than Casey was. And some of that was just a little bit weird, but I think they meant well. And I'd just like to know who the source is about Casey's reaction, because who would be friends with her? You have to wonder. I guess everybody can have a friend.
You can always have a friend.
I guess. But yeah, I would definitely recommend that people watch it. And it's too late for anything to really happen, of course. But I don't think that Casey Anthony will ever be able to have a normal life to just go out and about. She's always got to be looking over her shoulder. Because despite what the jury said, I think the public pretty much thinks she killed her child.
Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt of that.
No, there isn't. There certainly isn't. And I just feel good that George can feel a little more cleared now in the public. Because how do you respond to being called a child molester or a child killer? It's not easy to do. How do you prove a negative, right?
Yeah, you deny it. But people will say, of course, you're going to deny it.
Exactly. So at least this gives him, I don't know, a little bit of validity to his claims.
I would hope.
I would hope so, too. Well, it's just disturbing to think that Casey Anthony made up the whole molestation story to save herself when there are women and children out there who don't speak because they're afraid of not being believed. I want to believe all women. I think we should all believe women. And people like her just fuck it up for others who really are victims. Sigh, it's just really upsetting and frustrating. Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Eris, for your feedback. We really enjoy it, and we'd love to get feedback. So if you have some feedback to share with us, like a case suggestion, a beer, or comments on a case that we have covered, you can send an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com. Voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. Also, a quick reminder about our premium option of TCB, where you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. You get at least one a month, and we also send new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you note. We appreciate any support you can give us in any way. Just listening is great. That's enough right there. So we appreciate it, and we will see you next time at the Quiet End.
Come on down. We got plenty of seats.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.